The blight took half his herd before the first snow, and each morning Harlan counted fewer. He had nothing left but a failing ranch and a silence that had lasted 12 years. Then he found an orc woman, broken and bleeding, propped against a cottonwood. She didn't beg. She said, "I can heal your herd, sir, if you let me stay." By sunrise she was grinding roots he'd never seen, pressing paste into his weakest cow. By the third day that cow stood and bawled for grain, but she brought more than healing. She brought the enforcers hunting her, and a ritual that might save everything or burn it all down. Harlan had spent 12 years alone on the high plateau, the ranch crumbling around him since his wife's death. The blight was the final blow, a sickness that turned his cattle to bone and dust. Then Kithra appeared, an orc shaman with a shattered arm and knowledge of root magic that defied explanation. She claimed she could save his herd, and she proved it. But she brought a war to his doorstep. A group of tribal enforcers had tracked her for months, believing her healing arts were a corruption that needed to be purged. Harlan lied to protect her, and now both their lives hung on a ritual that would either purge the blight for good or unleash something far worse. The night of the ritual, the enforcers would make their move. But to understand why Harlan was willing to stand between a wounded orc and an armed band of her own kind, you have to understand what 12 years alone on the high plateau had already taken from him. The ranch had been his wife's dream. Ellen had seen the land when they were young, stood on the ridge with the wind pulling at her hair and said, "This is where we'll grow old." She didn't get to grow old. A fever took her in the third winter, swift and cruel, leaving Harlan with 1,000 acres of grazing land, 50 head of cattle, and a silence so deep it pressed against his ears like water pressure. He kept the ranch because keeping it was the only way to keep her. Every morning he walked the fence line she had mapped out with string and stakes. Every evening he sat on the porch she had painted yellow and watched the sun drop behind the peaks. The cattle became his only company, and then they started dying. The blight appeared without warning. One morning a heifer was standing with her head low, eyes clouded, coat dull. By nightfall she was on her side, breathing shallow. By the next dawn she was dead. Then another. Then 5 more in a week. Harlan sent samples to the county vet, a 2-day ride down to the valley, and got back a letter that said only unknown pathogen, no known treatment, recommend culling. He didn't cull. He couldn't. He walked the herd each morning, counting the ones still upright, and each morning the count was lower. By the time the first snow dusted the high pasture, half his herd was gone. The bank was 3 months behind on the mortgage. The feed supplier had stopped extending credit. Harlan was 62 years old, with arthritic hands and a back that ached when the weather turned, and he was watching the last thing he had left collapse into the frozen ground. The morning he found the orc woman, he was dragging a dead calf from the fence line. The calf had been born just 2 weeks earlier, one of the few bright spots in the ruin, and now it was a stiff weight on the end of a rope, eyes still open, tongue blue. Harlan was bent over the rope, shoulders burning, when he heard a voice. "I can heal your herd, sir, if you let me stay." He straightened. Propped against a cottonwood at the edge of the property was an orc woman. Her left arm was shattered, the bone angling wrong beneath the skin, and her green-gray skin was smeared with dried blood and trail dust. But her eyes were steady, flat, not desperate. The voice had been calm, as if she were discussing the price of grain. Harlan had lived long enough to know when someone was out of options, and this woman was out of options. But she wasn't begging. She was offering something she believed she could deliver. He had no reason to trust an orc. The tribes on the far side of the mountains had never bothered him, but he'd heard stories. Raids, territory disputes, old blood feuds that spilled over into human settlements. But a failing ranch was a dangerous thing. It made a man gamble on things he'd never gamble on otherwise. He put her in the tack room, a leaky shed behind the barn with a horse blanket and a basin of water. He didn't have a spare bed. He didn't have much of anything. By sunrise, she was in the barn. She had hobbled there on her own, dragging her broken arm, and she was grinding a paste from roots she'd pulled from the creek bed, roots Harlan had walked past 1,000 times without noticing. She pressed the paste into the flank of his weakest cow, a brindle heifer that hadn't eaten in 3 days. She worked with one arm, the other hanging useless, her fingers precise and patient. Harlan watched from the barn door. He didn't speak. He didn't help. He just watched. By the third day, the brindle heifer stood on her own, walked to the feed trough, and bawled for grain. Harlan had seen a lot of things in 62 years, but he had never seen a cow on the edge of death come back that fast. The orc woman, Kithra, she called herself, stayed in the tack room. She asked for nothing. She took the food he left at the door, a bowl of stew, a heel of bread, and she continued working. She moved through the herd with a quiet competence that unnerved him, pressing her pastes into flanks and shoulders, murmuring words in a language that sounded like stones rubbing together. Within a week, the blight had stopped spreading. The remaining cattle were still thin, still shaky, but they were eating. The dying had stopped. Harlan began to believe, against every instinct he had, that she could actually do it. Then the enforcers came. 3 riders on tall, scarred horses, their faces marked with the ritual scars of the Thorned Circle, the tribal authority that policed the orc clans beyond the mountains. They reined up in the yard just after noon, their leader a broad-shouldered woman named Greca with a voice like gravel sliding down a chute. "We are looking for a fugitive shaman," she said. "A woman named Kithra. She has committed crimes against the circle. She has damaged goods. You see her." Harlan stood in the yard, mud on his boots, his face a careful blank. He thought of the brindle heifer eating grain. He thought of the silence of the house since Ellen died. He said, "Haven't seen anyone matching that description." Greca looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes moved from his face to the barn to the tack room with its closed door. She didn't believe him, but she also didn't push. The enforcers made camp on the ridge above the ranch, a thin line of smoke marking their presence against the pale winter sky. They were waiting, for what Harlan didn't know, but they weren't leaving. That night Harlan went to the tack room. Kithra was sitting on the blanket, her broken arm now set in a crude splint she'd fashioned from barn wood and strips of cloth. The pain must have been immense, but her face was as flat as it had been at the cottonwood. "They're camped on the ridge," he said. "I know. I saw their smoke. They said you committed crimes." Kithra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The circle fears what it cannot control. I can heal the land, I can draw out the sickness that is killing your herd, but the power I use, the deep magic, it is old, older than the circle. They believe it corrupts. They believe I am a danger to the clan." "Are you?" She looked at him. "To those who would use the blight for their own purposes, yes. The blight is not natural. It was sent here. Someone wanted this land to die. If I purge it, the sender will know, and the circle will have to choose sides." Harlan felt a cold weight settle in his chest. He had thought the blight was bad luck, bad weather, bad soil, bad fortune. He had never considered it was deliberate. But if Kithra was right, then his herd hadn't just gotten sick. They'd been attacked, and whoever attacked them was watching. The ritual required 7 nights of preparation. Kithra explained it while she ground more root paste, her one good hand moving steadily. She would need to draw the sickness out of the land itself, pull it into a physical form, and then destroy it. The land had a spirit, she said, a deep current of life that ran beneath the soil. The blight was a wound in that spirit. Healing it meant opening herself to the wound, channeling the sickness into her own body in a controlled way, and then burning it out. If she succeeded, the herd would recover fully, the pasture would green in the spring, and the land would be whole again. If she failed, the sickness would surge, killing everything on the ranch, and she would die. There was a third possibility. If the ritual was interrupted, if someone broke the circle she was weaving, the sickness would not just surge. It would change. It would become something alive and hungry, a creature of rot and malice, and it would consume everything within a mile of the ranch. "That's what they're waiting for," she said. "The enforcers. They don't just want to capture me. They want to see if I'll attempt it, because if I do and they break the circle at the right moment, they can let the thing form. They can use it as proof that my magic is a blight. They can rally the clans against my kind of healing forever." Harlan stood in the tack room, the weight of it pressing on him. He had lied to a band of armed enforcers. He had sheltered a fugitive. And now she was telling him that the ritual to save his herd could unleash a monster if the wrong people interrupted. He looked at her broken arm, at the steady resolve in her face. He thought of Ellen, of the way she'd looked at this land with such hope. He thought of the brindle heifer eating grain. "What do you need from me?" he asked. Kithra's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted. I need you to stand guard. I need you to keep them from the barn for 7 nights. And I need you to trust me, because once it starts, I can't stop. If the circle breaks, we all die." Harlan nodded. He went to the gun cabinet and took out the rifle that had belonged to Ellen's father. He cleaned it, loaded it, and set it by the door. The first night of the ritual was 3 days away. On the ridge, the enforcer's campfire glowed like a watchful eye. And Harlan had started to wonder about something else. Who had sent the blight? Who wanted his land dead? The answer, when it came, would be worse than anything he'd imagined, and it was coming for all of them. The first thing that didn't fit was the fence. Harlan had walked that fence line for 12 years, and he knew every rotted post and sagging wire. 3 days after Kithra started the preparations, he was checking the north pasture and found a section of barbed wire near the creek that had been cut clean. Not rusted through, not snapped by a fallen branch. Cut with a tool, the ends neat and deliberate. The cut was fresh within the week. Someone had been on his land. Someone had come onto the ranch, bypassed the house and the barn, and opened a gap in the fence that led toward the back pasture where the blight had first appeared. Harlan knelt in the mud, tracing the cut wire with his fingers, and felt the cold weight shift from his chest to his gut. The blight hadn't drifted in on the wind or seeped up from the groundwater. Someone had delivered it. That night he went back to the tack room and asked Kithra a question he hadn't thought to ask before. "You said the blight was sent here. How?" She looked up from the bowl of paste she was grinding, her good hand moving in slow circles. "How do you send a sickness?" She set the bowl down. "There are ways, old ways. The circle does not permit them, but that does not mean they are forgotten. A blight like this, it does not start from a spore in the air. It must be anchored to the land, tied to a physical object, a focus, something buried in the soil where the water runs, where the cattle drink." Harlan thought of the creek, the cut fence, the back pasture where the first heifer had sickened. He thought of something else too, the surveyor's stake he had found 2 summers ago. He had pulled it out of the ground and thrown it in the barn, thinking it was a boundary marker left by the county. He hadn't thought about it since. But now, with the blight and the cut fence and the enforcers on the ridge, the stake felt like a piece of a puzzle he hadn't known he was assembling. He found the stake under a pile of old feed sacks in the barn. It was a standard survey marker, iron, about 2 feet long, but it was heavier than it should have been. When he turned it over, he saw that the base was hollow, packed with a dark, fibrous material that smelled like wet ash and something sharper underneath, something metallic, almost like old blood. Kithra was beside him before he called for her. She took the stake from his hands with her good arm, turned it over, and her flat expression tightened. "This is not a survey stake," she said. "This is a blight anchor. Someone buried this in your pasture to seed the sickness into the land. It would have been placed near water where the cattle gather. The blight spreads outward from the anchor, slow at first, then faster as it establishes roots." Harlan stared at the stake. Who would do that? Someone who wanted this land to fail. That doesn't narrow it down much. My land's been failing for years. No, she said. Someone who wanted this land to fail specifically, deliberately. The blight anchor is not cheap. It requires a shaman's craft, a ritual of binding, and a payment in blood. Someone invested resources in this. Someone who stands to gain from this ranch being abandoned. The enforcers made their move that same night. Harlan was walking the yard when Greca came down from the ridge alone, her face a mask of ritual scars and hard angles. She didn't threaten. She didn't posture. She simply stood at the edge of the porch light and said, "The shaman you're hiding, Kithra, she knows what's buried on this land. And you've just dug it up. That makes you complicit." Harlan didn't ask how she knew. He was beginning to understand that the circle's reach extended further than he'd thought. Complicit in what? In the blight. The blight is illegal under clan law. The crafting of a blight anchor is punishable by death. Kithra didn't just heal your cattle, rancher. She made the anchor. She's the one who poisoned your land. We're not here to persecute an innocent healer. We're here to execute a criminal. The words hit him like a physical blow. Kithra had made the anchor. She had poisoned his land. The same woman who had healed the brindle heifer, who had asked for nothing but a place to stay, who had set her own broken arm with barn wood. Harlan turned his head toward the tack room, and for a moment the world tilted. Then he thought of the cut fence, the fresh cut, the tool marks. If Kithra had poisoned the land, she wouldn't need to cut the fence. The land was already hers to work with, and Greca's timing was too convenient. She'd waited until he found the anchor, then came down to pin it on Kithra. That meant she knew about the anchor and had been waiting for him to find it. That meant she knew about the blight before it happened. That meant she was not hunting a criminal. She was covering one up. Harlan straightened his back, felt the arthritis protest, and looked Greca in the eye. You said she's a fugitive shaman. You didn't say anything about a blight anchor when you first rode up. You said she committed crimes against the Circle. Now suddenly she's the one who made the anchor. Which is it? Greca's scarred face flickered, a fraction of a second's hesitation. Then she said, we have evidence. We don't need to explain ourselves to a human. You're camped on my ridge, threatening my guest and telling me the woman who healed my herd is the one who cursed it. You owe me an explanation. I owe you nothing, but I'll give you a warning. The ritual she's planning, if she attempts it, the backlash will kill everyone on this ranch. The blight will surge, and whatever's left will be worse than dead. If you have any sense, you'll turn her over. We'll take her back to the Circle for trial. Your land might still recover. Harlan said nothing. Greca turned and walked back up the ridge. He watched her go, the shape of her dissolving into the dark. Then he went to the tack room and sat down across from Kithra. Did you make the anchor? He asked. Her flat expression didn't crack. No, but I know who did. Who? My brother. The word sat between them like a stone dropped into a still pond. Kithra set the grinding bowl aside and looked at the splint on her arm. My brother, Karoth, is a shaman of the old ways. He trained alongside me. We learned the deep magic together, but he disagreed with the Circle's restrictions. He believed the old power should be sold, not hoarded. He became what we call an ash-tongue, a shaman for hire, working for whoever pays in blood and silver. The anchor on your land is his work. I recognize the signature. The material, the way it's bound, the feel of it. He's the one who cursed your herd. Why would he do that? Because someone paid him. And because he knew that if a blight of this strength appeared near human territory, the Circle would eventually send someone to investigate. If I came, his sister, his rival, he could frame me. The Circle already distrusts me because I use the old magic differently. I use it to heal the land, to restore what's broken. He uses it to break things, and he's been selling his services to human interests for years. The enforcers out there, they're not independent. Greca is in my brother's pocket. He pays her, or he's blackmailing her, or he's promised her a cut of whatever the buyers are paying. She's not here for justice. She's here to make sure I don't disrupt the operation. Harlan processed this slowly, the way he processed a complicated piece of machinery, piece by piece, testing each connection. The buyers, he said. Who's paying your brother? Iron Peak Holdings, a development company. They've been buying up ranch land across the plateau for a decade. Land that fails, that goes into foreclosure, that can't be saved by ordinary means. Land that sits on mineral deposits. Your ranch is one of the last independent parcels on the high plateau. The company wants it. They've been trying to buy it from you for years, but you wouldn't sell, so they found another way. Harlan remembered the letters from Iron Peak Holdings. He had thrown them away without opening them, the way he threw away everything that reminded him the world outside the ranch existed. They'd offered to buy the land 3 times. He'd refused each time, not because he had a plan, but because selling meant leaving the place where Ellen's memory lived. And now they'd decided to remove him by other means. They'd hired a dark shaman to poison his land, drive his cattle to extinction, and make it impossible for him to stay. And they'd covered it by framing the one person who could expose them. But your brother's not just framing you, Harlan said. He's trying to kill you. Kithra nodded. The ritual I'm preparing, it will purge the blight, but it will also reveal the anchor's creator. The magic leaves a thread connecting the anchor to the one who made it. If I complete the ritual, the thread becomes visible. The Circle will see who really cursed this land. My brother cannot allow that. That's why Greca is here, not to capture me, to ensure the ritual never finishes. Harlan sat with the weight of it. He'd spent 12 years in a silence that had felt like a slow drowning. He'd watched his herd die and his land fail. He'd opened his door to a stranger and lied to armed enforcers for her. And now he was standing in the center of a conspiracy that reached from a development company's boardroom to a dark shaman's ritual circle, and the only person standing between him and the destruction of everything he had left was a one-armed orc woman who might be dead in a week. That night, the preparations for the ritual began in earnest. Kithra drew a circle in the floor of the barn, scratching it into the packed earth with a piece of chalkstone. She placed the blight anchor at the center, the hollow iron stake now wrapped in binding cloth. Around it she arranged 7 stones, each marked with a symbol Harlan didn't recognize. The ritual would take 7 nights. Each night she would open a channel to the land spirit, draw a portion of the blight into the circle, and burn it out using the stones as reservoirs. The anchor was the source, the stones were the filter. If the anchor was removed, the blight would destabilize. If the circle was broken before the 7th night, the sickness would surge and the blight would take physical form, a creature of rot and hunger. But if the circle held, by sunrise on the 7th day, the anchor would be empty, the blight would be gone, and the thread connecting it to its creator would glow bright enough for anyone to see. "That's the proof," Kithra said. "The thread. It will point directly to my brother. Once the circle sees that, Greca's story falls apart. The company loses its hold. The land is safe. And your brother, the circle will hunt him. He knows this. That's why he's already on his way here." She said it so matter-of-factly that Harlan almost missed the weight of it. He looked at her. "He's coming here. He has to. He can feel the ritual starting. Every shaman within 100 miles can feel it. The deep magic is like a bell. When I ring it, he will hear, and he will come to silence it." Harlan looked out the barn door at the ridge, where the enforcers' campfire still glowed. 3 of them now, plus whatever reinforcements Greca had summoned. And somewhere beyond the ridge, a dark shaman was traveling toward them, carrying the weight of a brother's betrayal and a decade of corruption. "How long do we have?" Harlan asked. "The ritual starts at moonrise tomorrow," Kithra said. "He could arrive as early as the 2nd night. He will come with everything he has." Harlan walked to the gun cabinet, took out the rifle, and set it on the table. Then he took out a second gun, an old shotgun that hadn't been fired in 10 years, and cleaned that too. He wasn't fighting a war. He was fortifying a barn. But some barns were worth more than kingdoms. The first night of the ritual passed without incident. Kithra sat in the circle, her good hand pressed to the anchor, her broken arm cradled in her lap, and she chanted in the stone-rubbing language until the air in the barn grew thick and heavy, until the smell of wet ash rose from the stake. Harlan watched from the barn door, rifle across his knees, and felt the land stir beneath his feet. Not a physical movement, but something deeper, something that resonated in his chest like the vibration after a bell. The cattle lowed in the pasture, and a wind came down from the peaks that carried no cold. When Kithra opened her eyes at dawn, the first of the 7 stones was black, charred as though it had been in a fire. The blight had been drawn out in a thread no thicker than a hair, and it had been burned. The herd would live. The land would heal. But the night had also sounded the bell, and the bell had been heard. On the morning of the 2nd day, Harlan saw smoke on the horizon. Not the enforcer's campfire, but something farther away, coming from the direction of the mountain pass. A column of dark smoke, too heavy for a camp, rising in a thin straight line. Signal smoke. Karoth was coming, and he wasn't coming alone. The enforcers on the ridge had been reinforced. 4 more riders had joined them in the night, and their camp had expanded into a small, armed outpost. When Harlan walked the fence line that afternoon, he found a second cut, fresh, near the creek. This time there was no wire. The entire post had been pulled from the ground. Someone was no longer being subtle. They were preparing the ground for an assault. At sunset, Kithra prepared the second circle. She looked paler than before, the effort of the first night draining color from her green-gray skin, but her voice was steady. "Once the 3rd stone is burned, the thread will start to show. My brother will attack before then. He cannot afford to let it reach the 4th night." "Then we hold him off for 2 more nights," Harlan said. "You and a rifle against a dark shaman and a dozen armed enforcers. It's my land. I've got the advantage." Kithra almost smiled. The expression looked strange on her face, unused muscles trying to remember how it worked. "You're either very brave or very stubborn." "Same thing," Harlan said. "Ellen used to say that too." That night, as Kithra began the 2nd phase of the ritual, Harlan took up position at the barn door. The shotgun was loaded. The rifle was loaded. He had a lantern, a canteen of water, and a pocket full of shells. The enforcer's camp was quiet, but he could see movement in the firelight, shapes moving with purpose. They wouldn't wait forever. Sometime after midnight, the bell of the deep magic rang again, and Harlan felt the land shudder with the second burning. The second stone turned black. 2 down, 5 to go. Somewhere in the dark beyond the ridge, a horn sounded, low and long and filled with a promise of violence. Karoth had arrived. The horn sounded again, closer now, and Harlan saw torches blooming in the dark like a line of red eyes descending the mountain pass. Karoth had arrived, and he was not coming alone. A dozen figures moved through the trees, their shapes distorted by the firelight, their silence more threatening than any war cry. At their head walked a tall orc with ritual scars that covered half his face, the markings of the ash tongue, the dark shamans who traded their souls for power. He carried no weapon. He didn't need one. The air around him shimmered with heat, and the grass beneath his feet withered as he passed. Kithra's brother had not come to negotiate. He had come to end the ritual, kill his sister, and burn the evidence of his corruption into ash. Greca met him at the base of the ridge, and even from the barn, Harlan could see the way her shoulders hunched, the deference of a subordinate reporting to a superior. The charade of an independent enforcer was over. Karoth listened, nodded once, and then turned his gaze toward the barn. His eyes were pale yellow, and even at 100 yards, Harlan felt the weight of them, the pressure of a mind that had learned to twist the natural world into shapes it was never meant to take. Kithra must have felt it too, because her chanting faltered for half a breath before steadying again. She was on the third night of the ritual now, sitting in the chalk circle with the anchor in her lap, the third stone already blackening at its edges. The thread connecting the anchor to its creator was beginning to show, a faint silver line that stretched from the iron stake, through the barn wall, and into the night beyond toward the man who had buried it. Karoth saw the thread, and his expression flickered, not with fear but with the cold calculation of a predator realizing its prey could still bite. He raised his hand, and the enforcers fanned out, encircling the barn. Then he spoke, his voice carrying across the yard with the unnatural clarity of magic. "Sister, you've done well to survive this long, but you know how this ends. The thread can be cut, the ritual can be unmade, and you've only got one good arm to defend it." The enforcers laughed, a hard sound that grated against the silence like gravel on glass. Harlan chambered a shell in the shotgun, the sound loud and deliberate. The laughter stopped. "Let me tell you something about ranchers," Harlan said, his voice as steady as he could make it. "We spend our whole lives fixing things that break. Fences, cattle, machinery, our own bodies. We don't stop because it's hard. We don't stop because the odds are bad. And we sure as hell don't stop because some painted-up shaman tells us how it ends." Karoth's pale eyes shifted to him, and Harlan felt the pressure increase like a thumb pressing on his windpipe. The human thinks he has a say in this. The human owns this land. You poisoned it, you're trespassing. And if you take one more step toward this barn, I will put a shell through your chest and let the circle sort out the paperwork. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Karoth smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "You don't know what's under your land, do you, rancher? You think this is about cattle and pastures. It's about something much older." He raised both hands, and the ground beneath the barn shuddered. A fissure cracked the earth just outside the door, and from it rose a stench so foul that Harlan gagged. Wet rot, old blood, the smell of a slaughterhouse left to fester. "Beneath this plateau runs a vein of deep magic," Karoth said. "The old ones called it the world spine. A reservoir of raw power that predates every clan, every kingdom, every map. Iron Peak Holdings didn't hire me to poison your herd. They hired me to extract the power. The blight is not just a sickness. It's a harvesting tool. Every cow that died fed the extraction. Every acre of dying land loosened the vein. And when the blight is complete, the vein will rupture, and Iron Peak will have enough raw magic to control half the continent." Harlan stared at the fissure, at the sickly green light leaking from it, and felt the cold weight in his gut turn to ice. He had thought he was fighting for his ranch. He was fighting for something much bigger, and he was severely outgunned. Inside the barn, Kithra's chanting rose in pitch. The third stone cracked down the middle and turned fully black, and the silver thread brightened, now a visible cord of light stretching from the anchor to Karoth's chest. The dark shaman staggered, his smile faltering for the first time. The ritual was taking hold. If the thread solidified completely, every shaman on the continent would see it, and Karoth's corruption would be exposed beyond any hope of denial. The circle would have no choice but to hunt him, and Iron Peak's scheme would collapse under the weight of the evidence. "Break the circle," Karoth snarled, and the enforcers surged forward. Harlan fired. The shotgun blast caught the first enforcer in the shoulder, spinning him into the dirt. The second shot was less precise. A warning burst that tore through the torchlight and sent sparks showering. The enforcers hesitated. They were warriors, but they were not bulletproof. Harlan ejected the spent shells and reloaded with the practiced efficiency of a man who had hunted his own food for 12 years. Behind him, Kithra's chanting became a shout, the words no longer a murmur but a defiant roar. The fourth stone was in her hand now, pressed against the anchor, and the light from the thread was blinding. The barn was shaking. Outside, Karoth raised his voice in a counter-chant, a dark mirror of his sister's words, and the fissure in the earth widened. Something moved in the depths of it, something vast and slow and hungry. "Kithra," Harlan shouted. "He's waking the vein. I know, keep him busy." She was bleeding from the nose now, the effort of the ritual tearing at her body. Her broken arm hung limp, but her good hand never wavered from the anchor. Harlan fired into the darkness, drove back another wave of enforcers, and prayed to a god he hadn't spoken to since Ellen died. The blight beast was rising. If Karoth succeeded in rupturing the vein, the creature would be born not from the ritual's interruption but from the raw magic itself, a thing of rot and hunger that would consume the ranch and everything for miles. The stakes had just gotten worse, so much worse. And then Greca did something unexpected. She stepped between Karoth and the barn, her scarred face twisted with something Harlan hadn't seen before: doubt. "You never told me about the vein," she said, her gravel voice pitched low. "You said this was a simple framing, a disgraced shaman, a weak land, a payoff. You never said anything about waking the world's spine." Karoth turned his yellow eyes on her, and the pressure in the air increased until Greca flinched. "You are a hired blade, Greca. You don't need to know. You only need to obey. I'm sworn to the circle, not to you. The circle is a shell. It has been for years. Half the council is on Iron Peak's payroll. The other half is too old to fight. You want to be on the winning side when the vein opens, or do you want to be buried under it?" The words hit the yard like a thunderclap. The circle was compromised. The institution that was supposed to police the clans, to prevent exactly this kind of corruption, was already bought. Kithra had been right. The conspiracy went all the way to the top. Greca's face worked through a dozen emotions: shock, rage, betrayal, and then settled into something harder. She turned toward the barn and raised her voice. "Warriors, the circle has been corrupted. This man is no shaman, he's a mercenary for a human corporation. You are sworn to protect the clans, not to serve a dark sorcerer's greed. Stand with me." 2 of the enforcers immediately moved to her side. The other 10 stayed with Karoth. It was not enough to even the odds, but it was something. Greca drew her blade and faced the dark shaman. "I'm going to give the rancher time. Do what you will with that." Karoth's smile returned, colder than before. "You just signed your death warrant." The battle that followed was chaos. Greca and her 2 loyal enforcers charged Karoth's line, giving Harlan precious seconds to reload and fire. The shotgun boomed again and again, each shot a punctuation mark in the madness. Inside the barn, the 4th stone shattered and went black, and the 5th was already in Kithra's hand. The thread was a column of silver fire now, burning through the roof and into the sky, visible for miles. Across the plateau, shamans would be waking, staring at the light and understanding what it meant. The ritual was almost complete. 2 more stones and the anchor would be purged, the blight destroyed, the conspiracy exposed. But Karoth was no longer holding back. He raised his arms and the fissure erupted. A tendril of something dark and glistening shot out of the earth, wrapping around one of Greca's enforcers and dragging him screaming into the pit. The blight beast was pushing through. Karoth wasn't trying to interrupt the ritual anymore. He was trying to destroy everything. Harlan fired at the tendril and the shot tore through it like smoke, doing nothing. The creature was immune to physical harm. Only the ritual could stop it now. Kithra screamed and the 5th stone went black. 1 left. Dawn was approaching. Harlan could see the sky lightening in the east. a pale band of gray above the peaks. If they could hold just a few more minutes, the seventh stone would be placed, and the ritual would complete. The blight beast would be forced back into the vein, the anchor would be destroyed, and Karoth's connection to it would be severed in a backlash that would likely kill him. But those few minutes stretched like an eternity. Karoth strode toward the barn, and the ground beneath his feet shattered with each step. The pressure in the air was unbearable now, a vice around Harlan's chest. He raised the shotgun, pulled the trigger, and heard the click of an empty chamber, out of shells. He reached for the rifle, but Karoth was faster. A wave of force slammed into him, throwing him against the barn wall. His vision blurred, and he tasted blood. Kithra was alone in the circle, the sixth stone, no, the sixth was already black, the seventh stone in her hand, the final piece. She looked at her brother through the blazing light, and for a moment the ritual paused. "You could have healed the world, Karoth," she said. "Instead, you chose to sell it." She pressed the seventh stone to the anchor. The world went white. When Harlan opened his eyes, the sun was up and the barn was full of light, not the pale gray light of a winter morning, but a warm golden wash that felt like spring. He was lying on his back in the straw, his chest aching where Karoth had slammed him into the wall, but he was alive. The barn was silent. The chalk circle on the floor had burned itself into the packed earth, the seven stones reduced to powder, and the blight anchor, the hollow iron stake that had nearly cost him everything, was a smear of rust and ash at the center. Kithra sat beside it with her head bowed, her breathing slow and ragged, but the silver thread connecting the anchor to her brother had snapped. Severed clean, the loose end coiled on the ground like a dead snake. The ritual had worked. The blight was gone, and Karoth was no longer standing in the yard. Harlan pushed himself upright and limped to the barn door. The yard was a war zone. The fissure Karoth had torn open was sealed. The earth pressed shut as if a giant hand had squeezed the wound closed, but the grass around it was scorched black in a 40-foot radius. The enforcers who had remained loyal to Karoth were scattered, some unconscious, some sitting with their hands bound by Greca's two warriors, their weapons piled in a heap. And Karoth himself, the dark shaman who had sold his soul and his people for corporate silver, was a twisted shape of charred bone and smoking cloth at the edge of the fissure. The backlash of the ritual had hit him like a lightning strike, channeling every ounce of the blight's corruption back into the one who had created it. He had not survived. Greca walked toward Harlan with her blade sheathed and her scarred face carrying an expression that looked almost like shame. She had lost one of her loyal warriors in the fight, the enforcer dragged into the fissure, but she was standing, and her voice was steadier than it had been since she arrived. "The thread's light was visible for 50 miles, she said. "Every shaman on the plateau saw it. The circle is already assembling a council. There will be questions, and I will answer them, all of them. Including the parts I was too blind to see." She paused, glancing at Karoth's body. "I owe you a debt, rancher, and I don't like debts." Harlan looked past her at the pasture where his cattle stood, the remaining 30 head that had survived the blight, now grazing on grass that looked greener than it had in years. The brindle heifer lifted her head and bawled, and the sound was not one of distress. It was a sound of health, of normalcy, of a life that had been pulled back from the edge. He didn't have words for what he felt: relief, exhaustion, a deep and complicated grief for the cows he'd lost, for the years of silence, for the wife he'd never stopped missing. So he simply nodded at Greca and walked back into the barn. Kithra had not moved. She was still sitting beside the anchor's remains, her broken arm cradled in her lap. But when Harlan knelt beside her, she looked up and her face was wet with tears. Not tears of pain or sadness. Tears of release, the kind that come when a weight carried for years finally lifts. "He was my brother," she said. "He was a monster, but he was my brother. I killed him." Harlan didn't say anything. He had no wisdom for that kind of loss, no words that could bridge the chasm between sibling love and the necessity of destroying someone who had become evil. He simply sat beside her in the straw, and they stayed there, the rancher and the shaman, as the morning sun climbed higher and the birds began to sing. The investigation that followed was as swift as it was thorough. Within 3 days, a delegation from the Thorn Circle arrived. 3 elder shamans in ceremonial robes, their faces unreadable, their questions precise. Greca gave her testimony and Kithra spoke for hours, laying out the full scope of the conspiracy. Iron Peak Holdings' bribery of Circle officials, Karoth's decade of dark magic for hire, the Blight Anchor, the planned extraction of the world spine vein. The elders listened and then they acted. By the end of the week, 7 members of the Circle Council were under arrest. Iron Peak's regional headquarters was raided by clan warriors and human authorities working together. The first time in living memory such a joint operation had occurred, and the company's executives were dragged out in handcuffs with news cameras broadcasting to the entire continent. The High Plateau Ranch, once a failing parcel of grazing land that no one wanted, became a protected site under joint Circle and county stewardship. The vein of deep magic beneath it was classified as a sacred resource, not to be tapped by any corporation, and Kithra, cleared of all charges, vindicated beyond question, was appointed its warden. She would stay on the land, not as a fugitive hiding in a tack room, but as a guardian with full authority to maintain the balance between the natural world and the power that flowed beneath it. And Harlan had a decision to make. The ranch was his, the herd was recovering. The mortgage was suddenly not a problem because the Circle had paid off the bank in gratitude, a gesture that embarrassed him but also let him sleep for the first time in a decade. He could stay. He could keep walking the fence line, keep the yellow porch, keep Ellen's memory alive in the place she had loved. But something had shifted in him during those 7 nights of the ritual. He had fought for the land, yes, but he had also fought alongside someone, and that was a thing he hadn't done since Ellen died. He wasn't alone anymore, and the silence that had felt like drowning now felt like a space that could be filled. He found the letter 2 weeks after the ritual, tucked behind a loose board in the kitchen wall where Ellen used to hide little notes for him, grocery lists, reminders to fix the gate, sometimes just a sentence like, "I love you, you stubborn man." This one was different. The paper was old and yellowed, the handwriting small and careful, dated 6 months before she got sick. "Harlan," it read, "I know what's under the land. I've felt it since the day we arrived, something old and alive and waiting. I think it chose us, or maybe it chose me, to watch over it. That's why we can't leave, no matter how hard the winters get. If something happens to me, promise you'll stay, promise you'll protect it. I've already sent a letter to the Orc Shamans. If the time ever comes, they'll send someone." She had known. All those years, Ellen had known about the deep magic, had felt it humming beneath the soil, and had never told him because she knew he'd worry, knew he'd try to rationalize it, knew the best way to protect him was to let him be a rancher while she carried the secret quietly. And then she had died, and Kithra had arrived 10 years later, and Harlan understood that his wife's death had not been a random tragedy. It had been the first move in a battle that had taken a decade to resolve. Ellen had set a chain of events in motion with a letter, and that chain had ended with a dark shaman's body in the yard and a golden morning that felt like spring. Harlan folded the letter carefully, tucked it into his shirt pocket, and walked outside. Kithra was in the pasture, her arm now properly healed by the Circle's best healers, walking among the cattle with a calm that made her look like she'd been born on the land. The brindle heifer nudged her shoulder, and she scratched behind its ear. "I found a letter from my wife," Harlan said. "She knew about the vein. She wrote to your people 10 years ago." Kithra looked at him and something passed across her face, not surprise but recognition, the quiet confirmation of a pattern she had suspected. "That letter reached the clan mothers," she said. "They kept it in the archives. When I fled my brother, they gave it to me and told me where to go. I didn't come here by accident. I came because your wife asked us to protect this place. I just didn't know if you'd believe me." Harlan looked out at the mountains, the same mountains Ellen had looked at, and felt the weight of 12 years shift into something lighter. "She always did think 10 steps ahead," he said. "So what happens now?" "Now we build something," Kithra said. "A sanctuary, a place where healers can learn the old ways without fear, where the vein is protected, not exploited, where the land teaches us instead of us taking from it." She paused. "You don't have to stay for that. The Circle will compensate you. You could retire somewhere warm." Harlan looked at the yellow porch, at the barn where he'd nearly died, at the pasture where his cattle were grazing under a sky that felt cleaner than it had in years. "I've been here 12 years," he said. "I think I'll stay a few more." He looked at Kithra. "If you'll have me." She smiled, the expression still awkward on her face but getting easier. "I could use a rancher. The cattle seem to like you. They like you more." "That's because I healed them. You just fed them." "Feeding counts for a lot," he said, and they walked back toward the house together, two unlikely allies standing on a land that had been cursed and was now being reclaimed, the silence between them no longer empty but full of the quiet hum of something beginning. On the porch, the yellow paint was peeling, but it would keep. There would be time for repairs. There would be time for everything. Time was what they needed, and time was what the land now offered. The sanctuary grew slowly, the way good things do. Healers came from the clans, drawn by Kithra's reputation and the quiet hum of the world spine beneath the soil. They built workshops and gardens, planted medicinal roots along the creek, and taught Harlan things about the ground he'd walked for decades that Ellen had always suspected, but never said aloud. The ranch no longer felt like a memorial to a lost past. It became a living, breathing place, full of voices and laughter, and the kind of purposeful work that makes a life worth waking up to. And every year on the anniversary of the ritual, Harlan walked to the spot where he'd found the orc woman propped against the cottonwood and reminded himself that a single act of trust can bend the course of everything that follows. This story is not just about a rancher and a shaman. It's about the things that lie buried beneath our feet, not always ancient magic, but often the bones of old grudges, corporate greed, and the quiet sacrifices of people who never asked for recognition. The vein of deep magic under the plateau could have become a weapon, a commodity, a tool for conquest. Instead, it became a protected sanctuary because one stubborn old man and one broken healer refused to let it fall into the wrong hands. Iron Peak Holdings never rebuilt its operations on the plateau. The joint investigation shattered their credibility, and the Circle's new Reform Council made sure no corporation would ever again treat sacred ground as a mineral asset. But the question that lingers, the one that keeps intelligence officers and clan elders awake at night, is how many other veins are out there. How many other lands are being poisoned quietly by people who know exactly what they're doing? And how many hidden guardians are fighting battles just like this one in places nobody is watching? If this story reached you, if you felt the weight of that barn at midnight or the silence of a 6-year-old learning to be quiet when violence comes, then you understand why we tell these tales. They aren't just fantasy. They're mirrors reflecting the real choices that shape our world. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which moment hit you hardest. The cut fence, the letter behind the loose board, or the brindle heifer standing up for the first time. We read every comment, and we're building a library of stories about the people who stand in the gap when everything is on the line. Hit subscribe, share this with someone who needs a reminder that stubborn hope can still win, and we'll see you in the next one. Until then, keep your fences mended. You never know what might come walking out of the trees.